In 1927, one company ran more department stores than any other in Britain. Not Marks and Spencer, not Harrods, Debenhams. 110 stores across the country, each one a small cathedral of counters. Silk gloves, tailored coats, a Christmas catalog that landed on the doormat every autumn like a promise. Queen Victoria herself had once been a customer. Grandmothers took their daughters there for a wedding dress. Those daughters took their own children for a school uniform. For 242 years, through 5 monarchs and 2 world wars, the doors never once closed for good. Then, in May 2021, they did. All of them. Within a matter of months, a company older than the United States of America simply ceased to exist on the British High Street. How does a business survive Queen Victoria, the Blitz, and 2 world wars, only to be undone by 2 decades of the internet? This is the story of what was lost and exactly how it happened. London, 1778. Wigmore Street lay on the northern edge of the city's fashionable West End, a short walk from the grand houses of Cavendish Square, where the wives and daughters of merchants, physicians, and minor gentry did their shopping. At number 44, a draper named William Clark opened a single narrow shop front, its windows dressed with bolts of silk, fine muslin, ribbon, and lace. There was no grand vision written down, no founding manifesto. Clark's ambition was more modest and more precise: to sell quality cloth and trimmings to a clientele who could tell the difference, and to do it from one respectable address in one respectable street. Inside, the shop smelled of new fabric and beeswax polish. Bolts of silk stood on end along dark wooden shelving. A counter ran the length of the room, where an assistant would unroll a length of muslin for a customer to feel between finger and thumb before a single word about price was spoken. The stock told its own story about who Clark expected through the door. Alongside dress, silks, and gloves sat mourning goods: black crepe, black ribbon, black bordered stationery, a staple of any respectable London draper shop in an age when a household might be plunged into formal grief at almost any time. There were parasols for the summer season, bonnets trimmed to the latest fashion, plates from Paris, and hosiery for both ladies and gentlemen. This was not a shop for the poor, nor quite for the aristocracy. It served the comfortable middle, the wives of professional men, the daughters of tradesmen who had done well, women who wanted to look as though they belonged in the West End without necessarily being born into it. For 35 years, the shop traded under Clark's name alone. Then, in 1813, a younger man named William Debenham became his partner. Debenham brought fresh capital and, it seems, fresh ambition. The sign above the door was repainted to read Clark and Debenham, and the business began for the first time to think beyond a single address. Within 5 years, it had opened a second shop in Cheltenham, then a fashionable spa town where London's polite society went to take the waters and be seen. A third followed in Harrogate. A joint catalog, grandly titled The Fashion Book, was soon circulating between the 3 shops. Dresses and trimmings ordered by post, long before anyone had coined the phrase mail order. None of this looked in 1813 like the beginning of anything larger than a well-run family drapery. There was no single dazzling insight, no eureka moment of the kind later retail legends are built on. What there was, instead, was steadiness, a shop that kept its word on quality, that did not overreach, and that quietly added a second name to its sign whenever a new partner proved himself worth trusting with it. Pooley, Smith, Freebody, each name stitched onto the last, each one a small act of faith that the business was bigger than any single man who had built it. It would take more than a century and the ambitions of one particularly restless Debenham before that quiet drapery on Wigmore Street became something the whole of Britain would recognize by a single word. By the 1970s, walking into Debenhams did not feel like entering a shop. It felt like entering an institution, one of the fixed points of a British high street alongside the parish church and the War Memorial, except this one smelled of Chanel No. 5 from the ground floor perfume counter and rang faintly with a lift attendant calling out the floors. For a British household of that generation, Debenhams was not one occasion. It was dozens of occasions, stitched across an entire lifetime. It was where a mother took a daughter for her first school uniform, checked against a list pinned to the changing room wall. It was where a young couple, newly engaged, went to put their names on a wedding list. Plates, glasses, an electric kettle, chosen together and paid for by relatives who wanted to give something that would last. It was where a father, uncertain and slightly out of his depth, was steered by a shop assistant toward the right size of shirt for an interview. None of these moments made the newspapers. All of them made the shop indispensable. Every autumn, the fashion book, by now a full-color catalog, thick as a telephone directory, arrived through the letterbox. For families who could not always afford to buy on the day, it did something more useful than simply showing what was for sale. It let them plan. A coat could be chosen in September and paid for, a little at a time, ready to collect before the cold set in. This was the quiet mechanics of layaway-style ordering, and for working households, it was the difference between going without and going prepared. At Christmas, the ground floor became something closer to theater. Windows dressed weeks in advance drew children with their faces pressed to the glass, tracing moving figures and painted snow. Inside, the toy department swelled to 3 or 4 times its usual size, staffed by assistants who had learned to wrap a box in seconds flat during the rush of Christmas Eve. Somewhere on nearly every high street in Britain, a Debenhams store was doing the same thing at the same time, which was, in its own way, the point. This was not a boutique experience. It was a shared one, repeated in Leeds and Portsmouth and Aberdeen, so that 2 strangers meeting for the first time could discover they had bought their wedding lists, their school shoes, and their Christmas presents in the same shop, 100 miles apart, and understood each other perfectly. The store itself worked hard to stay interesting. In 1993, Debenhams launched a range called Designers at Debenhams, putting genuinely fashionable names, Jasper Conran among the first, onto rails inside a shop that had, for decades, been reliably respectable rather than exciting. It was a clever piece of positioning. A Debenhams customer could now buy a designer label without paying designer prices, and without leaving the comfort of a shop she had known her whole life. It kept the brand from aging out of relevance even as its core customer grew older alongside it. Behind the counters, working at Debenhams was its own kind of institution. Long service was common and openly celebrated. A badge or a small ceremony for 25 years on the shop floor was not unusual, and many staff had started as teenagers and were still there in middle age, having watched several generations of the same families come through as customers. For school leavers in the 1970s and 80s, particularly young women, a job at the local Debenhams was often a first serious job. One with structure, a uniform, a staff discount, and the modest but real dignity of being trusted behind a till. By the early 2000s, the company was still expanding its ambitions rather than retreating from them. In September 2003, Debenhams opened its largest British store, yet inside Birmingham's newly built Bullring shopping center, proof, or so it seemed at the time, that the department store format still had a future worth building for. Nothing about that opening suggested a company in trouble. If anything, it suggested the opposite, a business confident enough to keep growing. What was it exactly that made a Debenhams store feel less like a shop and more like a fixture of the town itself? The sort of place a family simply assumed would always be there? Whatever the answer, in the very same year that Debenhams cut the ribbon on its grandest new store, a very different kind of deal was quietly being signed elsewhere. One that would, in time, decide the answer to that question for good. The decision that turned a respectable London drapery into a national institution was not made by William Debenham. It was made more than 100 years after his shop first opened by a chairman named Ernest Debenham. And it began not with a grand strategy, but with a debt. By the early 1900s, the business had grown comfortable rather than dominant. It ran a wholesale operation, supplying cloth and finished goods to smaller drapers and department stores across the country. A quiet, unglamorous trade that put Debenham's name on the ledgers of dozens of other businesses without ever putting it above their doors. Then in 1919, one of those trading partners could not pay what it owed. Rather than write off the debt, Debenhams took control of the business instead. That business was Marshall and Snellgrove, a well-regarded store on Oxford Street. A year later, the same pattern repeated with Harvey Nichols, the fashionable Knightsbridge store, still trading under its own name today. Debenhams had not set out to build an empire of shops. It had backed into one through the debts of others. Once the pattern revealed itself, Ernest Debenham pursued it deliberately. Through the 1920s, the company went store hunting in earnest, buying up long-established family-run department stores in towns across England. Each one already a fixture of its own high street, each one trading proudly under its own name. In 1928 came the largest single move, the purchase of the Drapery Trust, a holding company that brought with it a roll call of names any British shopper of the era would have recognized instantly. Bobby & Co., Bon Marché, Drages, Kennards, Marshalls, Swan & Edgar. By 1927, this run of acquisitions had made Debenhams the largest department store retailer in the country, with 110 stores under its control. What made this expansion unusual, and in time costly, was what Debenhams chose not to do with the businesses it bought. Rather than pulling down the old signage and rolling out a single national identity, the company largely left each store trading under its original name. A shopper in Torquay might spend her whole life visiting a Debenhams-owned store and never once hear the word Debenhams. To her, it was simply Kennards, the shop it had always been, run, as far as she could tell, exactly as it always had been. This was expansion by acquisition of loyalty, not by building a brand from scratch, and for decades it worked well enough. Local trust traveled with the local name. But a shop that keeps its old name also tends to keep its old habits. Each store continued to buy its own stock, manage its own warehousing, and set its own way of doing things, largely independent of the others. A structure that had made sense when each business was still its own company, and made progressively less sense the longer they all sat under one owner. There was no single central buying office negotiating better prices across the whole group, no shared systems for stock control, no coordinated view of where a new Debenhams-owned store might simply be competing against another Debenhams-owned store 2 streets away. In the post-war decades, as sharper, more centrally run rivals like Marks & Spencer pulled ahead, this old-fashioned structure, 18th century instincts inside a 20th century business, began to look less like an inheritance and more like a drag. It took until 1977 for the company to finally do what Ernest Debenham had never insisted on: pull down the old names. Bobby & Co., Marshalls, Kennards, and the rest, with the sole exception of Browns of Chester, were rebranded storefront by storefront as Debenhams. Half a century after the acquisitions that built the group, Britain's shoppers were, for the first time, told plainly whose stores they had been walking into all along. By then, expansion had also changed its shape entirely. The new battleground was not the historic high street, but the covered shopping center, and Debenhams moved with the times, becoming the anchor tenant expected to draw footfall into new developments, agreeing, among others, to anchor the Riverside Center in Shrewsbury, one of many such deals across the country. For a shop assistant, this new world could mean genuine opportunity: a modern store, regular hours, the chance to move between departments or even between towns as new branches opened. For a manager still running things the old way, it could just as easily mean pressure, new performance targets, new competitors under the same roof, a shopping center landlord whose interests did not always match the shop's own. None of this on its own spelled trouble. A business built from more than 100 locally beloved stores, finally united under one name and one modern strategy, looked in the late 1970s like a company entering its prime rather than approaching its end. What nobody walking through those newly rebranded doors could have known was that the very structure making Debenhams so trusted, a patchwork of once independent stores, each with its own long history and its own loyal following, would one day prove far harder to save than a single shop would have been. By 1998, Debenhams was no longer just one of Britain's retailers. It was one of its institutions, a name so familiar that it had stopped needing an introduction, the way nobody explains what a post office is for. That year, the company was demerged from the Burton Group and relisted on the London Stock Exchange in its own right, standing on its own for the first time in over a decade. The figures that came with independence told their own story of scale. Sales of more than 1.36 billion, over 27,000 people on the payroll, and a place among the top 5 retailers in the entire country. This was the high water mark, not the largest store count in the company's long history, but the moment Debenhams stood tallest as a single, modern, independent business, answerable to no parent company and second-guessing no one's strategy but its own. Reaching that height had taken television as much as it had taken trade. Through the 1990s, Debenhams built its name into the fabric of British popular culture with the same instinct that had once put designers at Debenhams on the rails, spotting a moment and getting there first. The company backed genuinely fashionable names on its shop floors, and its advertising leaned into a message that had quietly been true for 2 centuries, that good design and real quality did not have to live behind a velvet rope. A woman shopping for her daughter's christening outfit and a woman shopping for a designer coat could, without any contradiction, be standing at the same till. For staff, working at Debenhams during these years carried a particular kind of pride. This was not a company in survival mode, cutting corners to stay afloat. It was expanding, investing, opening larger and more ambitious stores, and the people on the shop floor felt the difference. Long-serving assistants who had joined as teenagers in the 1970s were, by the late 1990s, department supervisors training a new generation of school leavers, passing down the same unwritten rules about how a customer should be greeted, how a returned gift should be handled with grace rather than suspicion, how the Christmas rush should be organized so that nobody, however junior, was left drowning at the till on Christmas Eve. That generational thread ran just as clearly on the other side of the counter. A woman who had put her own wedding list together at Debenhams in the 1970s was, by the late 1990s, standing in the same aisles helping her own daughter choose glassware for a flat of her own. A man who had been measured for his first proper interview suit there as a 19-year-old was, 20 years later, bringing his son in for the same fitting, in front of the same tall mirrors. Few shops managed to be present at quite so many of a family's private milestones without ever becoming the story itself. Debenhams had perfected the art of being the background to everyone else's occasion. Present at the wedding, the christening, the first day of school, and rarely, if ever, the center of attention. Every November, that quiet presence became something closer to ritual. The Christmas catalog, descendant of the very first joint fashion book, printed for Clark and Debenhams' 3 shops back in the 1820s, still landed on doormats across the country, thicker and glossier than ever, and families still built their December around it, circling gifts in biro at the kitchen table. In branches up and down the high street, staff fielded a familiar seasonal request from customers, paying a little at a time toward a coat or a toy set, aside behind the counter, determined that it would be paid off and ready to collect before Christmas Eve. The same instinct for patient, planned spending that had defined the company's relationship with working households for a century and more. How many of a family's proudest moments, a wedding, a christening, a first grown-up interview, had quietly passed through a Debenhams till without anyone thinking to notice? None of that quiet, accumulated trust showed up on a balance sheet. And in 2003, a group of investors would look at Debenhams and see something the shop floor never had. Not a national institution, but an asset. One whose true value they believed was locked up in the very stores that generations of families had come to think of as permanent. In late 2003, a consortium of investors took Debenhams private. The names behind the deal, CVC Capital Partners, Texas Pacific Group, and the private equity arm of Merrill Lynch, trading together as Baroness Retail Limited, meant little to the average shopper walking through the doors that Christmas. To her, nothing had changed. The windows were still dressed for the season, the catalog still arrived on schedule, and the tills still rang exactly as they always had. That, in itself, was precisely the problem. The transformation about to take place at Debenhams was designed to be invisible from the shop floor. Private equity ownership works on a simple, well-worn principle. Borrow heavily against the company being bought, then use the company's own assets and cash flow to service that debt. For a business built almost entirely on retail premises, freehold stores in the center of nearly every major British town, accumulated over 2 centuries of expansion, Debenhams held one enormous asset that had never really been treated as one. It owned the ground beneath its own feet. The new owners moved to unlock that value. In what became known as a sale and leaseback arrangement, dozens of Debenhams' owned store buildings were sold off to property investors, with Debenhams then signing long leases to keep trading from the very same premises it had just given up owning. On paper, this raised an enormous amount of cash almost overnight. In practice, it converted a company that had once owned its high street presence outright into a tenant, committed to decades of rent on shops it no longer controlled. Rent that would have to be paid whether trade was good or bad, whether the high street was thriving or already beginning to empty out. The debt taken on to fund the deal and the obligations created by the leasebacks would sit on Debenhams' books for years to come, a fixed cost that no amount of Christmas trading could simply out-earn. None of this was visible to the woman circling gifts in the catalog at her kitchen table, or to the assistant folding jumpers on a Tuesday afternoon in Leeds. From the shop floor, Debenhams in 2004 looked exactly like Debenhams in 1998. Busy, familiar, permanent. The company continued opening new stores, continued investing in its designers at Debenhams range, continued behaving in every visible respect, like a business with its best years ahead of it. The consortium that owned it, meanwhile, understood something the customers did not, that a business can look perfectly healthy on the surface, while quietly being restructured to serve its owner's need for a return, rather than its customers' need for a shop that would still be there in 20 years. By 2006, Debenhams was relisted on the London Stock Exchange, and its original private equity owners took their profits and largely departed, leaving behind a public company still carrying the debt their ownership had created. The float was, by the measures that mattered to its former owners, a considerable success. What it left behind for the company itself was less straightforward, a balance sheet shaped by someone else's exit strategy and rent commitments that would outlast the investors who had signed them. There is a particular kind of dramatic irony in watching a company at this stage of its story. A regular customer walking into her local branch in 2007 had no reason to suspect anything was wrong, and every reason to assume the opposite. The store was busy, the range was fashionable, the Christmas display was, if anything, more elaborate than it had been a decade earlier. She could not have known that the ground beneath that display no longer belonged to the company selling her a wedding gift, or that a rising share of every pound she spent was now earmarked, before it ever reached a supplier or a member of staff, for the rent on a building the business itself had once owned outright. How long could a company this loved, this familiar, keep trading on trust and habit alone, while quietly renting back the very foundations it had built its reputation on? For a few more years, the answer was long enough that almost nobody noticed. The stores stayed open, the catalogs kept arriving, and the cracks remained exactly where the 2003 deal had put them. Beneath the surface, structural and for now, still invisible to anyone standing at the till. By the years following its 2006 return to the stock market, Debenhams was a public company in name only, free of the debts and obligations its previous owners had built into it. The leases signed during the sale and leaseback years still had decades left to run. The borrowing taken on to fund the original buyout still had to be serviced, and a business that might otherwise have spent the 2000s investing heavily in its stores and, crucially, in the early infrastructure of online retail, was instead spending a significant share of its income simply keeping up with obligations created by a deal its own customers had never heard of. This is where the private equity playbook leaves its clearest mark on a company's later history. The cash extracted through the leaseback arrangements had gone to the investors who arranged it, not into the tills or the stockrooms of the stores themselves. What remained for Debenhams to work with was a business carrying the debt of its own acquisition, now expected to compete against rivals who did not carry the same weight. Marks & Spencer, John Lewis, and a new generation of online-only retailers were all, in their own ways, freer to spend on the future. Debenhams was still paying, quite literally, for its past. The clearest documented sign that the company's underlying position was fragile came not from inside its boardroom, but from outside it. In 2011, the retail entrepreneur Mike Ashley, founder of Sports Direct, began quietly building a stake in Debenhams shares. Over the following years, that stake grew until it approached 30% of the company, a position large enough to give Ashley real influence over Debenhams' direction, and one that reflected a calculated bet that a company this weighed down by debt and this poorly positioned for the internet age was either heading for collapse or ripe for a takeover. Either way, Ashley's growing shareholding was itself a form of public diagnosis. A canny operator had looked at the numbers behind Debenhams' famous name and concluded the two no longer matched. Inside individual stores, the effects of years of underinvestment showed up in smaller, more human ways long before they showed up in headlines. Flagship branches that had once been kept in immaculate condition, fresh paint, working escalators, well-lit counters, began in some locations to show their age, tired fittings that were repaired rather than replaced, departments that quietly shrank as ranges were cut back, staffing levels trimmed to match a budget rather than a Saturday afternoon's footfall. None of this happened everywhere, or all at once. It happened unevenly, store by store, in exactly the way a company under sustained financial pressure tends to economize, not through one dramatic decision, but through 100 small ones, each individually defensible, each one quietly changing what it felt like to shop there. For the people who had spent decades on the shop floor, this was not an abstract financial story. It was the ordinary texture of coming to work. A department supervisor who had trained new starters through the confident 1990s was by the 2010s more likely to be managing reduced hours, an aging till system, or a section of the shop floor operating with fewer staff than it once did. Long service, once marked with pride, increasingly meant having watched a beloved employer become a harder place to work, not through any single villain's decision, but through the slow accumulation of choices made years earlier by owners who were no longer even in the room, and who, precisely, was supposed to be watching over the interests of those staff, the people who had given the company decades of their working lives. While its ownership structure was rearranged twice over in the space of a single career, the company was not blind to its predicament. Debenhams management spent much of the 2010s attempting to modernize, investing in its own website, closing weaker stores, negotiating with landlords to reduce the rent burden inherited from 2003. These were genuine efforts, not indifference, but they were also by this stage largely defensive, a company trying to repair a foundation while still standing on it, rather than one free to invest confidently in its future. Every pound spent servicing old debt or renegotiating old leases was a pound not spent building the kind of seamless online operation that rivals launched a decade earlier. Without that weight, we're already some way towards perfecting. By 2018, the toll of this position had become impossible to disguise from the outside. Profit warnings became a regular feature of the company's public reporting. Talk of company voluntary arrangements, a formal mechanism for renegotiating rents with landlords, store by store, began circulating publicly, an unmistakable signal that the underlying business could no longer support the commitments made on its behalf 15 years earlier. Mike Ashley, watching from his substantial shareholding, pushed repeatedly for greater influence over the company's direction, at one stage seeking a seat on the board, and later making a series of rescue proposals of his own. Moves that spoke less of confidence in the existing leadership and more of a conviction that the company's fundamentals, whatever its famous name still commanded, needed drastic intervention. None of this constituted a single fatal decision of the kind that makes for a clean villain. There was no single boardroom moment where an executive was overruled and the company's fate sealed on the spot. What there was instead was a slower and in some ways more troubling story. A company whose difficulties had been designed into it in 2003, patched and managed with real effort for more than a decade, and gradually, unmistakably, running out of road. The facts alone carry the weight of this chapter. A business built on 2 centuries of trust had been restructured, in the space of a few years, into an asset serving somebody else's balance sheet. And the bill for that restructuring was, by 2018, coming due. The first public admission came in April 2019. Debenhams filed for a form of administration, coupled with a company voluntary arrangement, a formal court-sanctioned process that allowed the business to renegotiate rents with landlords across dozens of stores in exchange for closing the weakest of them. 50 stores were earmarked to shut over the following 3 to 5 years. For a company that had spent 2 centuries opening doors, this was the first time in its history it had formally, publicly committed to closing them on this scale. The financial press treated it as a serious restructuring. For the people who work behind the counters marked for closure, it read as something closer to a death sentence delivered in installments. The process wiped out shareholders entirely, including Mike Ashley, whose near 30% stake, built up over nearly a decade of patient accumulation, was reduced to nothing in the same pre-pack administration deal that transferred ownership to the company's lenders. Ashley did not go quietly. He pursued the company aggressively over the following months, escalating rescue offers that eventually reached $200 million on the condition he be installed as chief executive. Each offer was rejected. He threatened legal action. None of it changed the underlying arithmetic. A company still carrying debt from a private equity deal 16 years earlier, now also carrying the accumulated cost of a high street that had visibly begun to empty, needed more than a change of ownership to survive. It needed a fundamentally different business. Then, in March 2020, the pandemic arrived, and the question of a slow decline became a question of survival measured in weeks. Non-essential retail across the United Kingdom was ordered to close. For a company already stretched thin by rent and debt, months of shuttered stores with no trading income were not survivable on the terms the business had been operating under. In April 2020, 1 year almost to the month since its first administration, Debenhams filed again. This was now a company that had entered a form of insolvency proceedings twice within a single year of the following one, a fact that told its own story about how little slack remained. Behind the headlines, individual stores were living through this in ways no annual report could capture. In one long-serving branch in the English Midlands, a department supervisor who had joined as a 19-year-old in the late 1980s, the same era the company had been confidently opening its largest ever store in Birmingham, now found herself explaining to staff half her age why the tills were closing early, why deliveries had slowed, why a rota that had once run 3 deep on a Saturday now ran 2. She had trained under managers who remembered the 1998 demerger as a moment of pride. She was now training nobody because there was very little left to train anyone into. Through the second half of 2020, the search for a buyer who might take on the whole business, stores and staff included, continued in the background, largely out of public view. The most serious interest came from Mike Ashley's Fraser's Group, though reporting at the time suggested his real motivation was narrower than a rescue. Taking vacant possession of Debenhams stores would let him expand his own chains, including House of Fraser and Sports Direct, without the cost of redundancy payments to existing staff. In November 2020, any remaining hope collapsed alongside a separate but connected disaster. Arcadia Group, the fashion empire behind Topshop and several other brands, and one of Debenhams' largest concession partners, renting floor space inside many of its stores, itself fell into administration. With one of its key trading partners gone and no rescue buyer willing to take on the stores, Debenhams administrators concluded there was no realistic route left to save the business as a physical retailer. Liquidation, not restructuring, was now the only path being planned. The public unwinding, once it began, moved with a speed that felt almost cruel after 2 centuries of steady presence. On 13th of January 2021, Debenhams announced the permanent closure of 6 stores in England, citing the ongoing COVID-19 lockdown as the immediate trigger. Among them was the flagship store on Oxford Street, the very address that had anchored the company's headquarters and its public identity for more than a century. Worcester, Weymouth, Staines, Harrogate, and Portsmouth closed alongside it. 320 jobs were lost in that announcement alone, a number small against the scale of what was coming, but the first time the closures had a face and an address rather than a boardroom document behind them. 12 days later, on 25th of January 2021, the company confirmed what its administrators had been quietly arranging for weeks. The online fashion retailer Boohoo agreed to buy the Debenhams brand name, its website, and its intellectual property for $55 million. It was, in one sense, a rescue. The name would survive, relaunched purely online. In every sense that mattered to the people still working in the remaining 118 stores, it was the opposite of a rescue. Boohoo had not bought a single physical shop. Every one of those stores and the jobs inside them was excluded from the deal entirely. Up to 12,000 people were told, in the same announcement that saved the Debenhams name, that their own jobs very likely would not be saved alongside it. What followed through the early months of 2021 was a long, quiet unwinding rather than a single dramatic event. Stock was cleared under liquidation signage in windows that had, only a year or two earlier, been dressed for Christmas with the same care they always had been. Gift cards accepted without question for 240 years of trading stopped being honored. Administrators are permitted to withdraw them once a company enters this kind of insolvency, and Debenhams did so in December 2020, leaving customers holding vouchers that had, overnight, become worthless pieces of plastic. For a company whose entire reputation had rested on the quiet promise that a purchase made today would still be honored tomorrow, this was its final, unintended betrayal of the trust it had spent 2 centuries building. On 5th of May 2021, the liquidators confirmed the date that closed the story for good. All remaining stores across the United Kingdom would shut permanently on 15th of May. In the final fortnight, longtime customers made a point of visiting branches they had shopped in for decades, less because there was anything left worth buying than because there was something worth witnessing. Staff who had spent 20, 30, in some cases nearly 40 years behind the same counters worked their final shifts among emptying shelves and stripped display stands, saying goodbye to colleagues and to a version of their working lives that would not exist again anywhere else. By the time the doors on Oxford Street were locked for the last time, Debenhams had been trading, in one form or another, for 242 years. It had outlasted the reign of 6 monarchs, 2 world wars, the rise and fall of countless smaller rivals, and its own repeated brushes with financial catastrophe. It could not outlast the debt loaded onto it in 2003, or the decade and a half it spent afterward trying to service that debt rather than build the future its customers had assumed, without ever needing to ask, would always be there. Something that had felt permanent precisely because it had always been there was simply gone. Not reduced, not restructured, gone. What survived was a name, not a company. In April 2022, Boohoo relaunched Debenhams.com as a purely digital marketplace. No stores, no stockrooms, no shop assistants behind a till. Dan Finley took over as the brand's chief executive that January, tasked with building something new out of the 242 years of trust the name still carried. The site sells clothing, beauty products, and homeware from dozens of other brands under the Debenhams banner, leveraging a website that, even in its final wind-down years, had drawn hundreds of millions of visits annually. It is, by the measures that matter to an online retailer, a reasonably successful business. It is also, unmistakably, not the Debenhams that closed its doors in May 2021. There is no counter to lean on, no assistant who remembers your name, no Christmas window for a child to press her face against. The name endured. The place did not. The 118 buildings left behind told just as varied a story. Some flagship stores, particularly in larger cities, were taken on relatively quickly by other retailers or converted into mixed-use space. Offices, gyms, occasionally housing. Others, especially in smaller towns where Debenhams had been the single largest store on the high street, proved far harder to fill. A department store the size of Debenhams' typical branch is not easily replaced by one tenant. More often, landlords were left carving a single vast shop floor into smaller units, a process that in many towns took years and left prominent buildings standing empty in the meantime. Dark windows on the high street's busiest corner, a visible reminder of what had gone. The effect on the towns themselves went well beyond one empty building. In shopping centers and high streets where Debenhams had served as the anchor store, drawing footfall that smaller shops relied on to survive. Its closure often triggered a wider decline. Independent traders who had built their businesses around the passing custom of Debenhams shoppers reported falling sales in its absence. Some shopping centers never fully recovered the vacancy left by an anchor tenant of that size, entering what industry analysts came to call, with grim familiarity, a mall death spiral. One closure making the next closure more likely, as reduced footfall made the whole site less attractive to the shops that remained. Debenhams was not, however, a story that stood alone. Its final years ran almost exactly parallel to the collapse of two other pillars of the same British high street: BHS, which closed for good in 2016 after its own pension crisis and management failures, and Arcadia, the retail empire behind Topshop, Topman, and several other household names, which entered administration within weeks of Debenhams' own final collapse in November 2020. Three companies, each one a fixture of British town centers for the better part of a century, effectively disappeared within a 5-year span. Taken individually, each had its own specific causes: its own private equity deal, its own pension shortfall, its own management missteps. Taken together, they told a harder story about the entire department store model itself, a format built for a Britain of high streets and Saturday shopping trips, competing against an internet that never closed and never charged rent. The lesson the industry drew from Debenhams' collapse was rarely about any single decision. It was about structure. A company loaded with debt through a private equity buyout and further burdened by leases signed away from properties it had once owned outright, entered the most disruptive decade in retail history with less room to maneuver than almost any of its rivals. Marks & Spencer, competing in many of the same categories, had its own well-documented struggles during these years. But it owned more of its estate outright and carried a fraction of the debt. The difference was not vision or even quality of merchandise. It was the balance sheet inherited from a deal made in 2003 and the 17 years the company then spent trying to outtrade a burden that never stopped compounding. For the 12,000 people whose jobs disappeared in the closures, the human cost varied enormously depending on age, location, and how long they had worked there. Younger staff, particularly those in larger cities, often found new positions in retail or moved into other sectors relatively quickly. For staff in their 50s and 60s, women disproportionately, who had spent 20 or 30 years in one branch and one department, reports at the time described a much harder search, competing for a shrinking number of retail jobs against candidates decades younger in towns where Debenhams had often been one of the largest employers of its kind. Some franchise-style concession staff, employed not by Debenhams directly but by the brands renting space inside its stores, lost their positions in the same wave without ever having worked for the company whose name was on the building. What does a town lose when the store that anchored its Saturdays for 200 years disappears, and nothing quite like it ever takes its place again? There is no tidy answer. A high street can fill an empty unit with a gym, a call center, a block of flats, but it cannot easily replace the particular accumulated function Debenhams had served. A single building where 3 generations of the same family might, without ever planning it, cross paths on the same afternoon. Each one there for their own reason, each one certain the shop would still be standing the next time they needed it. That certainty, more than any single department or product line, is what the collapse actually took away. Picture a Saturday afternoon in late November, somewhere on a British high street that could be almost anywhere. Leeds, Portsmouth, a market town whose name hardly matters, because the scene was the same in all of them. The Debenhams windows are dressed for Christmas, the glass catching the last gray light of an English autumn afternoon. Inside, the perfume counter sends its familiar scent drifting toward the escalators, the same scent it has carried for as long as anyone shopping there can remember. A child stands with her face close to the toy department display, tracing a painted reindeer with one finger, while her grandmother waits a few steps away, in no hurry because waiting here has never felt like wasted time. Somewhere above them, a lift announces a floor number in the same unhurried voice it has used for decades. At the counter, an assistant wraps a gift with the quick, practiced movements of someone who has done this 10,000 times before, and will, everyone assumes, do it 10,000 times again. Debenhams was never really in the business of selling coats and wedding china and school shoes. Not entirely. It was in the business of being present, quietly, reliably, without ceremony, at the moments a family actually remembers. It was there for the wedding list chosen together at a kitchen table, and there again, a generation later, when that same couple's daughter chose her own. It was there for the school uniform bought a size too big, on the sound advice that the child would grow into it by spring. It was there every autumn in the shape of a catalog that let a family plan a Christmas they could not quite afford outright, a little at a time, so that by December the gift under the tree looked exactly as effortless as everyone hoped it would. None of this made Debenhams unique in what it sold. What made it matter was how long it stayed, and how many of those ordinary, private milestones it was allowed to witness simply by being the shop that was always there. A town does not measure a department store by its profit margins. It measures it by how many of its own Saturdays it was quietly, dependably part of. Something built by drapers and partners over 2 centuries, trusted by 6 generations of the same families, does not deserve to be remembered only for the manner of its ending. It deserves to be remembered for the ordinary faithfulness of its middle, for every uniform fitted, every wedding list completed, every Christmas quietly delivered on time. To the men and women who spent their working lives behind its counters, some of them decades in the same department, this was never simply a company. It was a working life well spent, in service of people who trusted them without ever having to ask twice. To the founders who first hung a sign above a small shop on Wigmore Street, and to every partner whose name was added to it afterward, the debt owed is simple. They built something that outlasted them by nearly 2 centuries, and that is no small thing for anyone to have built. The stores are gone now, and nothing has quite replaced what they did. But somewhere tonight, a woman is telling her granddaughter about the Christmas window she pressed her face against as a child, and the granddaughter, listening, understands, without needing the details explained, that something real and dependable was once there. That memory, at least, was never for sale, and it is not something the closing of any door could take away.